with People's Task Force, which is a newer group that is fighting police brutality in Austin, and also with the International Socialist Organization, who are the main sponsors of tonight's discussion. And we are very excited to not prevent, but present this discussion about the new Jim Crow and the way that racism really operates through the criminal injustice system today. So our speakers are going to be Lucian, who is with the ISO, but also the People's Task Force, and he has been working very closely with our other speaker, who is LaKiza Fowler. Her brother was killed by the APD last summer. His name was Larry Jackson, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that shooting and everything that is surrounding that. And she'll talk a little bit more about what's happening right now with that struggle. The reason I'm not sitting here is we may have another speaker, and if he arrives, he is Sophia King's brother. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but the young gentleman who was shot, not fatally shot, but is in the hospital, shot by the APD 2 nights ago, was actually the cousin of Sophia King, who was shot to death by the APD in 2002. So he may or may not be able to join us, but if he does, he'll sit here and he will speak as well. Lucian's going to speak first and kind of give more of an overview, and then LaKiza will give some words and talk about her situation and whatever else she wants to talk about. And then we'll have just time for open discussion. So with no further ado, let's start with Lucian.
Thank you, folks. After the murder of Trayvon Martin pulled back the veil of ignorance that blinds most people to the day-to-day racism that pervades America, many of us thought we saw the next civil rights movement on the horizon. With protests across the country for Trayvon, civil rights leaders calling for the next March for Jobs and Freedom, and the murder of Larry Jackson Jr. by the Austin Police Department, which reignited the struggle locally, it looked as if we were on our way towards building a new movement for justice. Sadly, months after George Zimmerman was acquitted for killing an unarmed 17-year-old boy, months after the first black president spoke at the March for Jobs and Freedom, and months after APD killed an unarmed African-American man for going to the bank during business hours, we look around and find that we have no mass movement to look towards and lend a strength to our struggles. To explain why that is, we must understand the new system of racialized control and how it operates without explicitly mentioning race. Think back to September 20th, 2007, when 10,000 protesters descended upon Jena, Louisiana, in outrage that 6 black teenagers were going to be charged with attempted murder for beating up a white classmate at their high school. An attack which was believed to be stemmed from racially charged conflicts at the school, most notably nooses hung from a tree in the school's main courtyard. Much like then, we thought we had the kindling for a new civil rights movement, but as author and associate professor Michelle Alexander states, nooses, racial slurs, and overt bigotry are widely condemned by people across the political spectrum. They are understood to be remnants of the past, no longer reflective of the prevailing public consensus about race. Challenging these forms of racism is certainly necessary, as we must always remain vigilant, but it will do little to shake the foundations of the current system of control. The new caste system, unlike its predecessors, is officially colorblind. We must deal with it on its own terms. Alexander has coined the system as the new Jim Crow, and her book by the same name is helpful in detailing how this caste system has evolved over time and how it operates in the era of colorblindness. She starts by explaining how black chattel slavery developed in the second half of the 17th century. During that time, it was common to find black and white indentured servants as the agricultural economy developed in the southern half of the United States, along with other parts of the New World, there was a need for intense manual labor. As many indentured servants contracts became expired and they were free to till their own plot of land, the ruling plantation owners needed a new source of cheap or free labor. In the year of 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led an armed uprising of white indentured servants and black slaves against the planting elite who were not responding to their grievances. This multiracial fightback scared the ruling class so much that they responded by institutionalizing black slavery. They did this by instituting a racial bribe. Poor whites were given special privileges like greater access to Native American lands, being allowed to police blacks via slave patrols, and barriers were placed so that free labor would not be in competition with black slave labor. By the 1770s, we have a full-blown racial caste system defined by black slavery, while at the same time, whites were attempting to craft a new nation based on the ideals of equality, liberty, and justice for all. As Alexander puts, before democracy, black chattel slavery in America was born. The next period of racialized control that Alexander points to is the response to the Civil War, which formally ended the institution of slavery. With the period of Reconstruction that came out of the Civil War and the massive expansion of rights gained by blacks during that time, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, a public education system that emerged in the South, which gave blacks and poor whites the first opportunity to learn how to read and write, the response was a new system that was adapted to fit the needs and constraints at that time. In addition to the terrorist campaigns of the Ku Klux Klan, we begin to see the beginnings of the Jim Crow system that developed after the Civil War. Vagrancy laws such as mischief or insulting gestures were aggressively enforced upon blacks. From that, excuse me, folks. From that emerged the market of convict leasing, where black prisoners would be leased out to private firms for manual labor. As tens of thousands of African Americans were arrested and given arbitrary court fees with no means to pay them, they were put back to work in lumber camps, railroads, plantations, and dozens of corporations throughout the South, many of whom were literally worked to death. The draconian system of Jim Crow and segregation was eventually overturned by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. With blacks returning home from Europe at the end of World War II, being denied freedoms they were supposedly fighting for abroad, it became harder to maintain the system of racialized control. As the civil rights movement reached its height in the 1960s, which started as a challenge to anti-black racism, it turned into a multiracial fightback, linking up with other burgeoning movements of the time. This led to the end of Jim Crow, but as Alexander points out, a new system emerged that fits the needs and constraints of the time. With the Black Power struggle that emerged from the 1960s, a deeper consciousness about race developed, and it became harder to overtly discriminate on the basis of race. In order to fit the needs of the time, it would require a system of racial control that could not explicitly mention race, yet somehow maintain control over African Americans. A system that could legally discriminate on the basis of race, but not use race in its lexicon. That system is the criminal justice system, or as Alexander puts it, the new Jim Crow. What remains constant throughout these different periods is that these institutions exist to control the management of race and labor in the United States. These systems exist to drive a wedge between workers and inhibit them from fighting back against oppressive working conditions, be it from plantation owners who institutionalized black slavery, bosses who spread racist lies to keep black and white workers from building solidarity to fight for better pay, or managers who assign front-end higher paying jobs to whites and janitorial behind-the-scenes jobs of lesser pay to people of color. Racism is another tool for the ruling class to control the working class and maintain capitalism. As the ruling class looked to a new way of controlling African Americans, we begin to see the rhetoric of law and order come out from conservatives in the right wing as a response to the Black Power struggle and other movements of that time. During the 1964 presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater, he exploited black rebellion and uprising by framing them as riots and black crime, and laid the foundation for the Get Tough on Crime movement. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia was quoted as saying, "If blacks conduct themselves in an orderly way, they will not have to worry about police brutality." As the rules of discourse changed, or the politics, the way people talk about things changed, it became increasingly harder for segregationists to implement an explicitly racist agenda. So they instead used the racially sanitized rhetoric of cracking down on crime. During that time, we also begin to see two schools of thought develop regarding race, poverty, and the social order. Conservatives argued that poverty was not caused by structural causes, but by culture, particularly black culture. This view was further supported by the infamous Moynihan Report on the Black family, which attributed black poverty to black culture and a tangle of pathology. With Get Tough on Crime policies emerging and the reframing of the welfare debate as hardworking blue-collar whites against undeserving blacks who don't want to work, It laid the foundation for the criminal justice system to evolve into the next system of racialized control. In October 1982, Reagan announced his war on drugs, despite the fact that less than 2% of Americans viewed drugs as the most important issue facing the nation. This was no deterrent to Reagan because the war on drugs has had little to do with public concern for drugs, but more for the public concern for race. The war on drugs is key to the new Jim Crow because it is the single most important cause of the explosion in incarceration rates across the country. The war on drugs has made it possible for massive numbers of African American men to be swept in the criminal justice system for petty drug offenses, guilty or not guilty, and has led to more black men locked behind bars or under the watch of the criminal justice system than were enslaved in 1850. What's key to point out here is that when you look at statistics that control for race, there's no difference between drug usage amongst blacks and whites. In fact, studies show that whites are more likely to use drugs than blacks. If that's the reality, why is it that blacks and people of color are convicted at higher rates for petty drug crimes? We can even see this locally from our own Austin Police Department. According to the Office of the Police Monitor's annual report, APD stops and searches African Americans 13% of the time, despite them making up only 8% of the city's population. Because race has been explicitly taken out of the criminal justice system, we must point to the outcomes that fall along racial lines to point out how it's racist in its function. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice statistics, blacks accounted for 39.4% of the total prison and jail population in 2009. But according to the 2010 census of the U.S. Census Bureau, blacks comprise only 13.6% of the U.S. population. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did during apartheid. So when we look at the statistics, we have to ask ourselves, do African Americans and people of color simply choose to commit crimes more than whites? Or perhaps is there a more complex explanation that involves the systems and institutions that govern our day-to-day existence? Time served under the new Jim Crow doesn't end when you finish your sentence in jail or prison. The legal discrimination has only begun. If you're convicted of a felony for a minor drug offense, you have to carry that criminal label with you for the rest of your life. That label denies you access to public housing, education, access to decent paying jobs, the right to vote, serve on a jury, along with carrying the stigma of being labeled a criminal. During a forum organized by the Department of Justice a few months ago in response to the murder of Larry Jackson Jr., a Hispanic woman with her son was describing how a stupid mistake she made when she was young left her with a conviction. And because of that one mistake, she gets denied when she tries to apply for public housing. She gets turned down when she tries to apply for a job because she has to check off the box that says she was convicted of a crime. And she can't get public assistance to feed her son, who she can't feed because she can't get a job, because she has to check off the box that says she was convicted of a crime.
Right.
See where I'm going with this? In this new system of racialized control, we have to look at the outcomes and how it's poor people of color and the working class who are being targeted. At a rally in front of APD headquarters to demand justice for Larry Jackson, Austinite Richard Franklin described the fear he faces daily for living while black. I go to work, I pay my bills, I follow the law, I try to be a good person, yet I live with this post-traumatic stress disorder just for being me. Franklin is describing the fear that people of color have to live with as targets of the new Jim Crow. Even if you're committing no crime, you're still targeted for the color of your skin. Again, we have to look no further than our own Austin Police Department for an example with the murder of Larry Jackson Jr. While police were investigating a robbery that occurred earlier that day, Jackson tried to enter the bank during business hours, but was stopped by locked doors. After coming back a few minutes later, a bank manager noticed Jackson at the door and went outside to ask questions. A few moments later, the manager informed Detective Charles Kleiner, who was interviewing bank employees, that Jackson misidentified himself. Kleiner himself went to the door and questioned Jackson for a few minutes, and Jackson ran from the detective. Kleiner commandeered a civilian car to hunt down Jackson to a bridge near Shoal Creek and 34th Street. After a scuffle, he shot Jackson in the back of the neck. After the shooting, Assistant Police Chief Brian Manley told reporters they were confident Jackson was going to commit fraud at the bank. He would not comment why he was so confident, nor what type of fraud Jackson was planning to commit. When asked if it was illegal to run from the police, Manley said no, but added, it's never a good idea to run from the police. Jackson's death at the hands of police is a bitter example of the new Jim Crow that thrives in Austin and around the country. If we look at previous cases in which Austin police killed unarmed people of color, we can see there's a pattern of targeting African Americans. Take the case of Byron Carter Jr. On May 30th, 2011, Carter was killed as he was trying to flee two cops who approached him from behind, guns drawn, without identifying themselves. In a federal lawsuit that ended in June of this year, jurors ruled against the Carter family and absolved the APD of any responsibility. Byron Carter's grandmother, Gloria Clark, told reporters, "It was very political, it was very racial, and it was not fair." She added, "There is no justice at all, and I have no faith in this system." 2 years before that, the APD murdered Nathaniel Sanders while he was sleeping in the back of a car, and severely wounded Sir Lawrence Smith, who tried to flee as he awoke to gunfire. While heartbreaking, these examples give us new opportunities to fight back against the new Jim Crow. Cases like Larry Jackson, which so blatantly show the racism of the system, pull back the veil of ignorance like the Trayvon Martin case did earlier last year. We need to sharpen our understanding and critique of the system of racialized control if we're going to successfully challenge it next time we have a Trayvon Martin or Larry Jackson. For example, we need to understand how one method the system operates is by instituting a small layer of people of color leaders as mayors, chiefs of police, and state representatives. They help maintain the veneer of a post-racial society. This can be seen with our own chief of police, Art Acevedo, who is a Cuban American, yet manages a police force that disproportionately targets people of color. Another arm of the new Jim Crow is stand your ground laws and stop and frisk policies. These legalized forms of covert racism give police and vigilantes the impunity to stalk us and gun us down in the streets, even if you're minding your own business. And when we try to defend ourselves with legitimate cases of self-defense, we find that there's a double standard applied towards people of color. Take the case of Marissa Alexander, an African-American woman. In order to defend herself from an abusive boyfriend, she shot a warning shot out of fear for her life. Since that fateful day, she's had to fight a legal battle against the same prosecutor who let George Zimmerman walk free. Individually, these different arms of the new Jim Crow can operate independently from each other, but when you combine them all, you can see how they come together like strands of a cage. The strands of mass incarceration, the war on drugs, racial profiling, the discrimination in housing, education, and job opportunities when you're labeled a felon, all these things come together to entrap people of color and the working class, and you soon realize that this system was never meant to serve us. We can continue to fight for justice in the criminal case against Detective Kleinert and build pressure for the grand jury case by showing how District Attorney Rosemary Lindbergh continues to not prosecute police who murder African Americans. We can build fights to challenge policies like a campaign to remove the box that convicted felons have to check on a job application, or for our local police force to have relevant and meaning training on race and racial profiling. We can help build the fight to stop ticketing in our public schools, which introduces young people of color to the criminal justice system at an early age. We can link up the black struggle with our brown brothers and sisters who face the new Juan Crow and United States racist immigration policy. Sheriff Hamilton, who is supported by the Black Democrats in Austin, oversees deporting on average 19 immigrants a day, tearing apart families and locking up hardworking people. There are many points that we can build upon and link our struggles with, but the most important reason that we can do this work, as sad as it is to say, is because we know that APD will kill another unarmed person of color. I want to end my piece with this quote from Kalina Johnson, who is friends with Jurari Smith, APD's latest victim who was shot last Tuesday. "I want people to feel as if it was their brother, their cousin, their dad. I want them to know it's not only African Americans that this happens to. It can happen to you too." The fight back against the new Jim Crow is not just a fight back for people of color. It's a fight back for all of humanity and the systems of control that are being used by the ruling elite to maintain capitalism. Thank you.
Okay. Now LaKiza is going to talk to us. No, after you.
Oh. Thank you all for coming out and showing support for our cause. It has been a very difficult year for us. So anyway, just to continue with Lucian's talk on the new Jim Crow, I find it very interesting that the government keeps records on how many police officers are killed in the line of duty, but they don't keep records of how many people police officers kill. They pretend that they are under attack while not acknowledging that they are attacking Black and brown citizens. Not only are they attacking us, they are killing us. While researching the prevalence of officer-involved shootings in the United States, I found that 95% of officer-involved shootings were declared legally justified and that officers are not criminally charged. These so-called peace officers continue to have free range to shoot and kill without being held accountable. And it's not just police officers, it's also racist individuals that feel like our lives don't matter. They do not understand that the people that they are killing are human beings that have families that love and care for them. I want to know, for me, what will it take for these people to realize that our lives do matter? My brother, he leaves behind 3 children. One is special needs, and just one of his medications on a monthly basis is $800 a month. And now my brother's not here to take care of his family like he did. I just think it's this cop needs to be. I can't even. That's right. He needs to be indicted, and he needs to serve time for what he did.
Right.
Yes. And then, I mean, it doesn't just stop with my brother. Just a couple of weeks ago, a 47-year-old Black lady was killed by a Bastrop deputy who had only been on the force for 9 months. First, the sheriff's office reported that supposedly she was armed. Then later, they retracted the statement saying that she wasn't. So obviously, she wasn't a threat to the deputy. If these officers and deputies are so fearful for their lives, then they shouldn't be on the force. I mean, because they're going to come into contact with all kinds of people every day. And if they are so fearful, then they shouldn't be there. That shouldn't be their job. It was reported last week after the killing that the deputy supervisor went into HR and changed his personnel records regarding his training. And I think that goes to show you that they're covering up things right there. And they always seem to shoot first, and they don't even ask questions later. They just cover it up. And then they get to go on paid vacations or retire, such as, you know, in my brother's case, they allowed the cop to retire. So there's also a case of a young lady named Renisha McBride in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. In November of 2013, she had a wreck, and she went to the home of a man named Theodore Wafer. She was seeking help because her cell phone battery died. And instead of answering the door or calling 911, he shot her in the face with a shotgun blast. And afterwards, he called 911. Then he hung up on the 911 operator. Michigan is a stand your ground state, just like Florida. Miss McBride, she was an unarmed 19-year-old Black lady. Wafer, the guy, is a 54-year-old white man. The media started reporting that Miss McBride had a blood alcohol level nearly 3 times the legal limit. But what does that have to do with her being shot in the face?
That's right.
You know, witnesses have said that she appeared confused but not combative in any type of way. The guy's attorneys have said that he cares for his elderly mother and was afraid for his life. But they always seem to portray they portray the victim as a criminal, and then they portray the person that's doing the killing as this hero, or, oh, he takes care of his mom and that's okay. No, it's not okay. And I feel like the media plays a huge role in how victims of police shootings are portrayed. They first start out by putting out coverage of how the officer has been on the force for so long and is a model officer. Then Then they go straight to the victim's past.
Yep.
They find a criminal record or something bad about them, and they make that their agenda. They never once say that the incident has nothing to do with their past. In the case of my brother, I find it really funny that, well, not funny, but they immediately started to portray him as a thug and a criminal by posting his mugshots from when he was a teenager. He was 32 when he was killed. And then 7 months later, the media wants to come and ask us, well, you know, what kind of person was Larry and how are y'all dealing with it? You know, and then at that point, you just don't even speak to the media. It just appalls me because my parents weren't notified of my brother's death until 25 hours later after. This happened on Friday, July 26th, and the cops, they didn't come to my parents' house until Saturday. My brother it was 4/24 is what's on the death certificate when he died, that Friday. Saturday at 5:45 p.m. is when they came and notified my parents that my brother was dead. And they said that they couldn't identify him because he had a fake ID on him. So my question is, if he was so hard to identify, then how is it that less than 24 hours after they identified him, you know, they found his criminal record easily? You know, that's, you know, it would appear to me that he'd be easily identifiable with fingerprints, you know. So, and to me and my family, it all sounds like a cover-up.
That's right.
During the initial investigation, the detective asked Larry, what was he doing on that side of town? So that to me shows that it was a racist act.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, they never questioned the man that came in and robbed the bank that morning. You know, he was an old white man.
Yep.
Right.
But immediately they questioned Larry because he's on this side of town and he's a black young man. So 4 days after Larry's murder, the police department filed a custodial death report listing his death as a justifiable homicide. 4 days later, yeah. And how can his death be a justifiable homicide if this cop is saying that it was an accident? You know, then a few days later, after some reporter saw that, they asked the department, how could that be? And then they changed it to pending. They changed his cause of death as pending. And people keep asking me, what do I want when I say that I want justice for Larry? For me and my family, we want the Travis County Grand Jury to indict this cop, and he needs to be in prison for the rest of his life.
Yep.
For it was just a cold-blooded murder.
That's right.
And I want them to call it murder because that's exactly what it was.
That's right.
And I ask for your continued support for me and my family, and especially for my mom. My mom goes and talks to the grand jury in the morning, and from what I hear is that they don't generally talk to the families of these victims, of police killing victims.
Right.
So if y'all could just please keep us in your prayers, and thank you all for coming out.